The emergence of the new California Republic was not an accident of history nor a sudden political awakening, but the result of a very specific convergence of post-war conditions that existed in Southern California during the first century after the Great War, conditions that were rare across the wider wasteland and almost entirely absent east of the Rockies. When the bombs fell in 2077, much of the region that would later become NCR territory avoided the direct annihilation suffered by major metropolitan centers, leaving behind a fractured but usable landscape of ruined towns, arable land, pre-war roads, and scattered infrastructure that could be repurposed rather than rediscovered from nothing. Unlike the capital wasteland or the glowing sea, Southern California retained pockets of relatively stable radiation levels, allowing agriculture to resume earlier and more reliably, which in turn enabled permanent settlements to grow beyond subsistence survival. The presence of Vault 15 proved especially critical, as its inhabitants were deliberately selected from diverse cultural, political, and ideological backgrounds. A Vault tech experiment intended to observe social conflict, but which instead seeded the wasteland with groups capable of cooperation, negotiation, and long-term planning once the Vault inevitably failed. When these former Vault dwellers spread into the surrounding region, they carried with them not only literacy and technical knowledge, but also an understanding of governance, law, and communal organization that most wasteland tribes lacked. At the same time, the absence of a dominant pre-war remnant power in the region created a political vacuum, as the Enclave remained hidden offshore and the Brotherhood of Steel deliberately isolated itself, hoarding technology rather than ruling openly, which left room for civilian authority to emerge without immediate annihilation. Early settlements such as Shady Sands benefited from proximity to fertile land, access to clean water through pre-war purification technology, and relative insulation from large-scale raider confederations, allowing population growth to outpace violence-driven collapse. The destruction of the Unity and the defeat of the Master removed the single greatest existential threat to organized human society in the region, eliminating the possibility that all emerging settlements would be absorbed or exterminated by a centralized super-mutant army, and in doing so, created a psychological shift among survivors, who for the first time began to believe that large-scale threats could be defeated through cooperation rather than appeasement or flight. Trade routes slowly re-emerged as caravans connected settlements, like Shady Sands, Junktown, and the Hub, creating economic interdependence that rewarded stability and punished constant warfare, while the Hub's merchant houses demonstrated that wealth accumulation through trade was safer and more profitable than raiding, subtly reshaping wasteland values over several generations. The use of bottle caps as a standardized currency further reinforced this shift, enabling taxation, long-distance contracts, and debt, all of which are prerequisites for a functioning state, rather than a loose alliance of tribes. Equally important was the gradual normalization of violence through law rather than personal vendetta, as towns began appointing sheriffs, guards, and councils, reducing the reliance on individual mercenaries and signaling a move toward institutional authority. The rise of educated individuals trained in medicine, engineering, and administration, many descended from Vault populations, allowed settlements to maintain infrastructure rather than merely exploit it until failure, preserving wells, generators, and defenses across decades instead of months. Population density also reached a critical threshold, as towns grew large enough that leadership roles became specialized rather than absolute, making governance scalable beyond a single charismatic figure. The legacy of pre-war American ideology, preserved through holotapes, books, and oral tradition, provided a familiar political framework centered on representation, law, and civic duty, which settlers adapted into something both nostalgic and aspirational, even if their understanding of pre-war democracy was incomplete and idealized. Crucially, the early decades of post-war California saw a relative balance of power between settlements, preventing any one town from dominating through force alone, which encouraged diplomacy, alliances, and eventually formalized unions for mutual defense. Environmental pressures such as droughts, crop failures, and raider incursions further incentivized cooperation, as isolated communities learned through repeated disaster that survival favored collective action over stubborn independence. By the time Shady Sands began transitioning from a fortified village into a political nucleus, the surrounding region had already developed the economic, cultural, and demographic foundations necessary for a republic to exist, even if its future flaws were already embedded in those foundations. The new California Republic was therefore not born from idealism alone, but from a wasteland that had, through hard experience, reached the rare conclusion that stability, bureaucracy, and shared sacrifice offered better odds of survival than endless fragmentation, setting the stage for the first true post-war nation to rise from the ashes of the old world. Shady Sands began not as a vision of nationhood or power, but as a fragile experiment in survival born from the dispersal of Vault 15, whose failure forced its inhabitants into a hostile wasteland where ideological differences that once defined them became secondary to the need for food, water, and security. The settlement was founded by a small group led by Aradesh, a former vault dweller whose leadership style reflected both the cooperative principles learned underground and the harsh pragmatism required above it, resulting in a community that blended tribal resilience with structured governance rather than relying on brute force or charismatic tyranny. Located near arable land and sustained by a functioning water purification system salvaged from vault technology, Shady Sands was able to support agriculture at a scale uncommon in the early wasteland, producing surplus crops that stabilized population growth and reduced dependence on scavenging or raiding. Unlike many contemporaneous settlements, Shady Sands deliberately avoided becoming a trade hub dominated by merchant elites, instead focusing on self-sufficiency and communal defense, which fostered a strong internal identity and loyalty among its citizens. The use of adobe-style construction, defensive walls, and organized guards reflected an understanding that permanence required both cultural cohesion and physical security, especially in a region still plagued by raiders, wildlife, and the looming threat of supermutants prior to the fall of the Unity. The transformation of Shady Sands accelerated dramatically after the defeat of the Master, as the removal of the supermutant threat allowed the settlement to expand without fear of annihilation, leading to increased immigration from smaller, less stable communities seeking protection and opportunity. This influx diversified the population further, introducing new trades, skills, and political perspectives that gradually pushed Shady Sands beyond the scale of a village and toward that of a proto-city. The leadership transition from Aradesh to his daughter Tandy marked a crucial turning point, as her long tenure brought continuity, institutional memory, and an increasingly sophisticated approach to governance that emphasized diplomacy, legal frameworks, and long-term planning over reactive survivalism. Under Tandy's guidance, Shady Sands began formalizing laws, codifying rights and responsibilities, and establishing bureaucratic roles that extended authority beyond personal relationships, making governance resilient to leadership changes and population growth. The settlement's reputation for stability and fairness, attracted neighboring communities into alliances rather than conquests, positioning Shady Sands as a neutral arbiter in regional disputes and a natural center for collective decision-making. As trade routes expanded, Shady Sands leveraged its political reliability rather than economic dominance, hosting councils, treaties, and negotiations that gradually shifted power from merchant cities like the Hub towards civic institutions rooted in representation rather than profit. Education and literacy became quietly transformative forces, as the preservation of pre-war texts and the training of administrators ensured that governance could scale alongside territory, preventing collapse under its own complexity. The gradual expansion of farmland, the integration of new districts, and the standardization of law across an expanding population reinforced the idea that Shady Sands was no longer merely a settlement, but the heart of a broader social project. By the time the new California Republic was formally declared, Shady Sands had already assumed the functional role of a capital in all but name, serving as the administrative, ideological, and symbolic center of a growing nation. Its evolution from a modest tribal settlement into a political capital was driven not by conquest or technological supremacy, but by decades of accumulated trust, consistent leadership, and an unbroken commitment to stability in a world defined by chaos, making it uniquely suited to become the foundation upon which the new California Republic would be built. The founding of the new California Republic represented the moment when a collection of settlements, long bound by trade, mutual defense, and shared hardship, consciously chose to transform informal cooperation into a permanent political entity, drawing heavily from fragmented memories of pre-war American governance while adapting those ideals to the brutal realities of the wasteland. This transition did not occur through revolution or conquest, but through a gradual alignment of interests. As communities surrounding Shady Sands came to recognize that their survival and prosperity were increasingly dependent on standardized laws, coordinated defense, and a unified voice capable of negotiating with powerful factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel and major trading houses. Under the leadership of Tandy, whose experience spanned both the earliest days of Shady Sands and its emergence as a regional authority, the idea of a republic was framed not as a return to the old world, but as a safeguard against its mistakes, emphasizing representation, civilian rule, and the subordination of military power to elected leadership. Early delegates and council members drew inspiration from pre-war texts describing constitutions, senates, and civil rights, though their interpretations were necessarily incomplete, filtered through oral tradition and limited surviving documentation, resulting in a system that valued democratic process even as it remained flexible enough to function in an unstable environment. The founding charter of the new California Republic established the principle that citizenship was not determined by birth, wealth, or military service alone, but by participation in and contribution to the collective good, an idea intended to integrate diverse wasteland populations into a shared civic identity rather than allowing tribal divisions to persist unchecked. Law was elevated above personal authority, with courts and elected officials tasked with resolving disputes that would previously have been settled through violence, signaling a deliberate shift away from frontier justice toward institutional accountability. Early ideals also included the protection of individual rights, such as property ownership, freedom of movement, and access to trade, reflecting the belief that economic independence was inseparable from political freedom, even in a world where scarcity remained a constant threat. The Republic's founders envisioned expansion not as imperial domination, but as voluntary inclusion, assuming that neighboring settlements would seek membership once the benefits of stability, protection, and legal consistency became evident. This assumption shaped early policy, leading to diplomatic outreach and treaties rather than immediate military campaigns, and reinforcing the image of the NCR as a civilizing force rather than an occupying power. The role of the military was carefully defined in these formative years, with the army positioned as a defender of citizens and borders rather than an instrument of internal control, a distinction that reflected deep distrust of pre-war authoritarianism and standing armies unaccountable to the public. Education, infrastructure, maintenance, and trade facilitation were identified as core responsibilities of the state, underscoring the belief that a republic could not endure on force alone, but required informed citizens and functioning systems to support them. At the same time, the early NCR carried within it the seeds of future contradiction, as its ideals assumed a level of unity, resource availability, and moral alignment that would be increasingly difficult to sustain as territory and population grew. The romanticized vision of pre-war democracy often overlooked the systemic inequalities and corruption that had contributed to the old world's collapse. And while the founders sought to avoid repeating those failures, their incomplete understanding made them vulnerable to repeating them in new forms. Nevertheless, in its earliest days, the new California Republic stood as a genuine attempt to replace the law of the strong with the rule of law, embodying a cautious optimism that humanity could rebuild not merely through survival, but through shared principles, setting a moral and political foundation that would guide, and eventually strain, every phase of its expansion. The early territorial expansion of the new California Republic unfolded not as a sweeping campaign of conquest, but as a slow and often uneven process of absorption that reflected both the Republic's stated ideals and the practical pressures of survival in a contested wasteland. In the decades following its formal founding, the NCR existed as a growing nucleus surrounded by independent towns, tribal groups, and trading centers, each weighing the risks and benefits of alignment with a centralized authority that promised stability but demanded conformity. Expansion during this period was driven primarily by geography and necessity, as nearby settlements shared water sources, farmland, and trade routes with NCR territory, making isolation increasingly impractical in the face of raider threats, resource shortages, and inter-settlement disputes. Communities, such as those along established caravan routes, found that NCR affiliation offered standardized laws, protection from banditry, and access to broader markets, incentives that often proved more persuasive than military pressure. The Republic's diplomats and administrators framed absorption as mutual advancement, emphasizing representation in the NCR Senate and access to infrastructure rather than subjugation, an approach that contrasted sharply with the overt domination practiced by many wasteland powers. In practice, however, the process was rarely seamless, as cultural differences, lingering tribal identities, and skepticism toward centralized authority created friction that required compromise, negotiation, and at times coercion. Some settlements willingly petitioned for inclusion, seeking relief from constant insecurity, while others resisted, fearing loss of autonomy, increased taxation, or the imposition of unfamiliar laws that conflicted with long-standing customs. The NCR responded to resistance with a mixture of patience and pressure, offering economic incentives and protection agreements, while quietly establishing military outposts nearby, a strategy that allowed expansion without overt declarations of war. As borders extended, the Republic began integrating disparate legal systems into a unified code, a process that required redefining property rights, land ownership, and citizenship in regions where such concepts had previously been informal or non-existent. This legal standardization often benefited landholders and traders aligned with NCR norms, while marginalizing nomadic groups and smaller communities whose livelihoods depended on flexible land use, sowing the first seeds of resentment that would later surface more violently. Administrators sent from Shady Sands worked to establish local councils and courts, but these institutions were frequently staffed by NCR loyalists rather than local leaders, creating a perception that governance flowed outward from the capital rather than upward from the people. Military presence, though limited in these early years, became increasingly visible as expansion progressed, with patrols and forts designed to secure borders and trade routes, reinforcing the Republic's claim to authority even in regions not yet fully incorporated. The absorption of neighboring communities also accelerated demographic shifts, as citizens migrated toward more stable NCR territories, draining population and labor from independent settlements, and further incentivizing their eventual inclusion. While the Republic maintained that expansion was voluntary, the cumulative effect of economic dependency, legal pressure, and security imbalance left many communities with little meaningful choice. Despite these contradictions, early expansion succeeded in creating a contiguous and relatively stable core territory, transforming the NCR from a city-state into a regional power with defined borders and a growing sense of national identity. This phase of growth established patterns that would define all future expansion, blending diplomacy with force, idealism with pragmatism, and inclusion with quiet domination, ensuring that the Republic's rise was both a testament to post-war cooperation and an early warning of the tensions inherent in rebuilding civilization amid the ruins of the Old World. The creation of the new California Republic military marked a decisive shift from a loose system of local militias and volunteer guards to a centralized, state-controlled force, reflecting the Republic's recognition that ideals alone could not secure borders or protect citizens in an increasingly complex and hostile wasteland. In its earliest years, defense had been handled by town guards and ad hoc alliances, but as NCR territory expanded and responsibilities multiplied, this decentralized approach proved insufficient against organized raider bands, territorial disputes, and the growing need to project authority beyond core settlements. The establishment of a formal army was framed as a defensive necessity rather than an instrument of conquest, with early doctrine emphasizing protection of trade routes, response to external threats, and support for civil authorities, mirroring the founders' desire to avoid the militarism that had defined pre-war America's final years. Recruitment drew heavily from NCR citizens seeking stable pay, rations, and a sense of purpose, transforming military service into both a livelihood and a mechanism for social mobility within the Republic. Training and organization were standardized, with ranks, uniforms, and command structures designed to create cohesion across diverse regions. While equipment relied largely on salvaged pre-war firearms and armor, rather than advanced technology, reflecting both resource limitations and ideological distrust of technological dependence. As the army matured, it became an essential tool in facilitating expansion, escorting caravans, securing newly incorporated territories, and establishing forts that functioned as symbols of NCR authority as much as military installations. The presence of troops reassured loyal citizens, but often provoked anxiety among newly absorbed communities, where soldiers were seen as enforcers of distant laws rather than protectors of local interests. Despite official policy favoring diplomacy, the military increasingly influenced expansion decisions, as the ability to deploy troops made it easier to assert claims over contested land and deter resistance without prolonged negotiation. The army's growing size required a steady flow of supplies, tying military logistics directly to agricultural output, taxation, and trade, and embedding the armed forces deeply within the Republic's economic system. This integration blurred the line between civilian and military priorities, as protecting supply routes and resource zones became synonymous with defending the state itself. Commanders were expected to uphold civilian authority, yet the practical realities of frontier warfare granted them significant autonomy, especially in distant territories where communication with Shady Sands was slow or unreliable. Over time, this autonomy fostered a culture of pragmatism that sometimes conflicted with the Republic's legal ideals, as officers made unilateral decisions in the name of stability or efficiency. The military also played a crucial role in shaping NCR identity, as shared service created bonds across regional and cultural lines, reinforcing the idea of a single nation rather than a collection of settlements. At the same time, the reliance on a standing army marked a departure from the founders' early caution, introducing the risk that military needs would drive political choices rather than the reverse. By the end of this formative period, the NCR military had become indispensable to the Republic's expansion, simultaneously enabling the spread of law and order while laying the groundwork for future overreach, as the same force designed to protect the Republic would later strain its resources, test its ideals, and redefine its relationship with the wasteland it sought to unify. As the new California Republic expanded beyond its original heartland, it became increasingly clear that military force alone could not sustain long-term authority, leading the Republic to rely on law, citizenship, and taxation as quieter but more enduring instruments of control over newly incorporated territories. The extension of NCR law into frontier regions was presented as a civilizing process, promising predictable justice in place of arbitrary violence, yet it also served to standardize behavior and suppress local customs that conflicted with the Republic's legal framework. Courts, judges, and administrative officials were dispatched to settlements that had only recently joined the NCR, often replacing informal councils or tribal elders with appointed magistrates trained in Shady Sands, reinforcing the idea that legitimacy flowed from the capital rather than from local consensus. Citizenship became a powerful mechanism for integration, offering legal protections, voting rights, and access to trade networks in exchange for allegiance to the Republic and compliance with its laws, effectively redefining identity in political rather than cultural terms. For many wastelanders, NCR citizenship represented safety and opportunity, but it also imposed obligations that were unfamiliar and often resented, including military service, legal accountability beyond local norms, and submission to centralized authority. Taxation, more than any other policy, revealed the tension between Republican ideals and expansionist reality, as the need to fund infrastructure, bureaucracy, and the growing military required consistent revenue drawn from regions that had not yet fully benefited from NCR investment. Agricultural settlements were assessed based on land productivity. Trade hubs were taxed on caravan traffic, and citizens were required to contribute caps or goods, formalizing an economic relationship that transformed independent communities into fiscal assets of the state. While taxation was justified as necessary for shared defense and development, in practice it often flowed back toward the core territories first, leaving frontier regions feeling exploited rather than supported. The enforcement of tax law relied on a combination of bureaucratic oversight and military backing, further entangling civilian governance with armed authority and reinforcing perceptions that compliance was mandatory rather than consensual. Legal codes also redefined land ownership, converting communal or traditional land use into registered property, a shift that favored established farmers and emerging elites, while marginalizing nomadic groups and smaller communities unable to navigate the new system. These changes encouraged settlement and agricultural expansion, but also displaced populations that did not fit neatly into the Republic's economic model. Over time, the promise of citizenship evolved from an invitation into a shared political project into an expectation of conformity, as non-citizens found themselves excluded from trade protections and legal recourse, effectively pressured into joining or leaving NCR-controlled territory. The Republic's emphasis on law and taxation allowed it to govern vast areas with relatively few troops. But this efficiency came at the cost of goodwill, as many frontier inhabitants experienced NCR authority primarily through tax collectors, legal summons, and regulatory restrictions rather than tangible improvements to their lives. By institutionalizing control through paperwork and policy rather than overt violence, the new California Republic succeeded in transforming expansion into administration. Yet this transformation also marked a departure from the voluntary union envisioned by its founders, embedding resentment and resistance within the very systems designed to hold the Republic together. The rapid economic growth of the new California Republic was both the engine of its expansion and the source of some of its most destabilizing contradictions, as the transition from subsistence survival to surplus production created wealth on a scale unseen since before the Great War, while simultaneously concentrating power in the hands of those best positioned to exploit it. Central to this transformation was the expansion of large-scale agriculture and ranching, particularly Brahmin herding, which became the backbone of the NCR economy by supplying food, labor, leather, and trade goods to both civilian populations and the ever-growing military. As land was surveyed, registered, and protected under NCR law, wealthy ranchers and trading families accumulated vast holdings, giving rise to the so-called Brahmin barons, whose economic influence soon translated into political leverage within the Republic's legislative institutions. These elites financed caravans, secured contracts to provision army units, and controlled key supply routes, embedding themselves deeply within the infrastructure of expansion while shaping policy in ways that favored continued territorial growth. Resource exploitation extended beyond agriculture, as NCR authorities encouraged mining, salvage operations, and water reclamation projects to support industrial needs, often granting extraction rights to private interests in exchange for taxes and political support. While these ventures increased overall productivity, they frequently prioritized short-term output over long-term sustainability, exhausting local resources and leaving frontier communities with degraded land and polluted water. The promise of economic opportunity drew waves of settlers into NCR territory, swelling populations and labor pools, but also intensifying competition for land and employment, particularly in regions where infrastructure lagged behind expansion. Small farmers and independent traders found themselves increasingly dependent on larger conglomerates for access to markets and protection, eroding the self-sufficiency that had once defined post-war survival. The Republic justified this concentration of wealth as a necessary phase of development, arguing that strong economic actors could stabilize supply chains and fund public works. Yet the benefits of growth were unevenly distributed, with core territories prospering while outlying regions struggled under the weight of taxation and requisition. Military demand further distorted the economy, as priority contracts diverted resources away from civilian use, inflating prices and creating shortages that disproportionately affected the poor. The Brahmin barons leveraged these conditions to consolidate their influence, using their ability to supply food and transport as leverage in political negotiations, effectively shaping expansion policy to open new lands for exploitation rather than consolidating existing territories. Economic growth also fueled corruption, as officials accepted bribes or favors in exchange for favorable land assessments, tax exemptions, or exclusive contracts, blurring the line between public service and private profit. Despite these flaws, the expanding economy reinforced the NCR's image as a land of opportunity compared to the lawless wasteland beyond its borders, attracting settlers who were willing to endure inequality in exchange for relative security and stability. Over time, however, the Republic's reliance on resource exploitation and elite-driven growth undermined its founding ideals, as economic power became increasingly detached from civic responsibility, transforming expansion from a collective endeavor into a system that enriched a few while extracting ever greater sacrifices from the many. The conflict between the new California Republic and the Brotherhood of Steel represented the first true test of the Republic's ability to assert authority against a technologically superior and ideologically incompatible power, fundamentally reshaping the trajectory of NCR expansion and permanently altering its strategic priorities. The Brotherhood, descended from remnants of the United States military, viewed itself as the rightful steward of advanced technology, adhering to a doctrine that prioritized containment and preservation over civilian access, a philosophy that placed it in direct opposition to the NCR's vision of widespread reconstruction and industrial growth. Initially, relations between the two factions were defined by cautious coexistence, as the Brotherhood's isolationist tendencies limited direct interference with NCR affairs, allowing the Republic to expand within California with minimal resistance. This balance collapsed as NCR economic growth increased demand for advanced weaponry, energy infrastructure, and industrial technology, bringing the Republic into conflict with Brotherhood patrols enforcing strict technological embargoes. Skirmishes escalated into open hostilities, as the NCR challenged the Brotherhood's claim to authority over technology that the Republic considered essential for national defense and development. Despite lacking the power armor and energy weapons that defined Brotherhood forces, the NCR leveraged its numerical superiority, industrial capacity, and expanding logistics network to wage a war of attrition, stretching Brotherhood resources and forcing them to defend multiple bunkers and supply routes simultaneously. The conflict exposed the strengths and weaknesses of both factions, demonstrating that advanced technology alone could not guarantee victory against a population-based state capable of sustained recruitment and resupply. For the NCR, the war marked a turning point, as military expenditure surged and expansion slowed, redirecting resources toward maintaining fronts rather than incorporating new territories. Casualties and material losses fueled domestic debate, with critics questioning whether expansion had provoked an unnecessary war that undermined the Republic's founding ideals. The Brotherhood's eventual retreat into isolation preserved its core assets, but effectively removed it as a regional power, clearing a major obstacle to NCR territorial ambitions while leaving behind unresolved tensions and scattered enclaves. In the aftermath, the NCR emerged as the dominant force in California, but the cost of victory reshaped its governance, normalizing high military spending and reinforcing the belief that strength and security were prerequisites for political authority. The war also hardened NCR attitudes toward dissent and non-compliance, as the Brotherhood's resistance was cited as justification for stronger enforcement measures in newly annexed regions. Strategically, the conflict taught the Republic to prioritize quantity, supply chains, and infrastructure over technological parity, influencing future campaigns and reinforcing reliance on conventional forces. The defeat of the Brotherhood removed a philosophical counterweight to NCR expansion, allowing the Republic to pursue industrialization and resource exploitation with fewer constraints. Yet it also marked the moment when the NCR began to define success in terms of dominance rather than consensus. By confronting and outlasting a technologically superior adversary, the new California Republic proved its viability as a nation-state. But in doing so, it embraced a model of expansion rooted increasingly in power projection, setting a precedent that would shape every conflict to come. The expansion of the new California Republic beyond its original heartland depended as much on the deliberate development of infrastructure and trade networks as it did on military or diplomatic efforts, reflecting the Republic's recognition that sustainable control of distant territories required more than law and force. It required connectivity, commerce, and logistical integration. Early roads, bridges, and wagon trails were repaired or constructed from pre-war remnants, linking Shady Sands and surrounding settlements to outlying communities, creating a web of movement that facilitated the transport of food, resources, and troops, while simultaneously projecting the presence of the state into regions that had previously been isolated or contested. Caravan networks evolved into arteries of economic and political influence, connecting farms, trading posts, and defensive outposts in a manner that bound communities to the Republic's economic and administrative systems, incentivizing compliance through interdependence rather than coercion alone. The NCR recognized that control over key trade hubs, water sources, and fertile valleys was essential not only for revenue generation but also for sustaining populations and feeding armies in territories increasingly distant from the capital. Forts, watchtowers, and garrisons were strategically placed along these routes to deter raiders, enforce law, and ensure the uninterrupted movement of goods and personnel, creating corridors of influence that extended the Republic's reach without requiring constant direct oversight. Infrastructure investment went beyond mere roads and defenses, encompassing irrigation systems, granaries, and way stations that increased agricultural output and supported growing population centers, reinforcing the perception that NCR governance brought tangible benefits in exchange for loyalty. Trade routes also facilitated cultural integration, as the circulation of people, information, and materials introduced frontier settlements to NCR norms, legal practices, and civic identity, gradually transforming independent communities into functioning parts of a larger nation-state. The Republic's reliance on infrastructure as a tool of expansion, however, introduced vulnerabilities, as long supply lines became targets for raiders, rival factions, and environmental hazards, demonstrating that connectivity could be both a source of strength and a potential weakness. In addition, the emphasis on resource-rich corridors tended to concentrate development along predictable paths, leaving hinterlands less defended and less integrated, a pattern that would later complicate administration and defense. Economic incentives tied to infrastructure, such as trade tariffs, tolls, and preferential access to markets, encouraged settlements to accept NCR authority voluntarily, effectively turning logistical networks into instruments of political control. This strategy reinforced the link between commerce and loyalty, embedding the Republic's influence in the everyday survival and prosperity of frontier populations. Over time, These efforts allowed the NCR to project authority far beyond the original Shady Sands core, creating a recognizable territorial footprint while cultivating the administrative capacity to manage diverse regions. Infrastructure and trade became the backbone of the Republic's expansion, ensuring that annexation was accompanied by practical benefits and sustained governance. Yet they also laid the groundwork for overextension, as the demands of maintaining roads, forts, and supply lines would increasingly strain both economic and military resources in territories that were only tenuously committed to the state. By linking communities through commerce and connectivity, the NCR transformed isolated settlements into nodes of a unified political and economic system, demonstrating that the power to expand relied as much on organization, engineering, and trade as it did on arms or ideology, and setting a precedent for the dual role of infrastructure as both lifeline and instrument of authority in the Republic's continuing growth. As the new California Republic expanded across California and into contested frontier regions, the very mechanisms that enabled growth, bureaucracy, taxation, and centralized administration began to expose the Republic to new internal stresses, chief among them the proliferation of political corruption that would both facilitate and undermine its authority. With territory and population increasing at a pace that outstripped the administrative capacity of Shady Sands, local officials and legislators found opportunities to manipulate laws, divert tax revenues, and favor allies or wealthy interests, creating a network of patronage and favoritism that often conflicted with the Republic's founding ideals of fairness and civic duty. The rise of powerful landowners, trade magnates, and Brahmin barons further complicated governance, as these individuals leveraged their economic influence to secure political positions, sway legislation, and protect personal interests, effectively embedding private gain within the apparatus of state authority. The geographic scale of expansion made oversight difficult, allowing remote governors, tax collectors, and military officers significant autonomy, which in some cases led to abuse, embezzlement, or decisions made for personal advantage rather than the common good. Military officers, tasked with both defense and enforcement of NCR law in far-flung territories, occasionally bypassed civilian oversight, justifying unilateral actions as necessary for security, a practice that blurred the line between legitimate governance and coercion. This combination of economic inequality, administrative opacity, and decentralized power created systemic vulnerabilities, fostering resentment among frontier populations who perceived themselves as overtaxed, underrepresented, or subject to arbitrary authority. Political factions within the NCR Senate and Council emerged, with differing visions for the Republic's growth, often lobbying for policies that favored particular regions, trade networks, or social classes, further entrenching divisions within the political system. The expansion itself exacerbated these problems, as the need to integrate new settlements often meant granting concessions, pardons, or preferential treatment to local leaders in exchange for allegiance, creating inconsistencies in law enforcement and uneven application of policy. These tensions were compounded by ideological drift, as the Republic's focus shifted increasingly from civic cohesion to territorial control, military maintenance, and economic exploitation, leaving the principles of representation, equality, and accountability vulnerable to neglect. Popular dissatisfaction in outlying territories occasionally manifested as petitions, protests, or minor uprisings, which were often quelled with a combination of diplomacy and selective force, reinforcing the perception that local compliance was expected rather than freely chosen. Even as the NCR celebrated its growing influence and success in consolidating power, these internal strains foreshadowed deeper challenges, illustrating that rapid territorial expansion created not only logistical and military burdens, but also moral and political dilemmas that threatened the Republic's cohesion. Corruption and administrative overreach, while facilitating short-term control, slowly eroded public trust and introduced contradictions between the ideals of the new California Republic and the realities of governing a vast and diverse wasteland, a tension that would continue to shape policy, law enforcement, and the very character of the state in the decades that followed. The Mojave Campaign represented one of the most ambitious and consequential military and political operations undertaken by the new California Republic, serving as both a test of the Republic's capacity to project power across distant regions and a demonstration of the strategic significance of Hoover Dam as a resource, defensive position, and symbol of control over the American Southwest. By the time the NCR turned its attention to the Mojave Wasteland, the Republic had already consolidated its core territories in California. But expansion into the desert posed unique logistical, environmental, and political challenges that required careful planning and coordination of military, economic, and diplomatic resources. Hoover Dam, pre-war infrastructure of immense strategic value, controlled both water supply and hydroelectric power across the region, providing whoever held it with the ability to shape settlement patterns, industry, and agricultural development far beyond the immediate vicinity. Recognizing the dam's potential, the NCR sought to secure it, to guarantee a reliable energy source for future settlements, and to establish a foothold that would prevent rival powers, particularly Caesar's Legion, from exploiting the region's resources or threatening NCR expansion. The campaign combined conventional military operations, the fortification of key choke points, and negotiation with local factions, demonstrating the Republic's reliance on a mix of diplomacy and force to extend its influence while minimizing direct confrontation where possible. Engagements with hostile groups, including raider gangs, independent militias, and the formidable Legion, tested NCR forces' logistical endurance, coordination, and command structure, revealing both the strengths and limits of an army accustomed to expansion within California's more hospitable climate. Caravans and supply lines became crucial to sustaining operations across the Mojave's arid terrain, forcing the NCR to develop a network of way stations, outposts, and fortified supply depots that mirrored the Republic's broader strategy of infrastructure-driven expansion. The campaign also underscored the interplay between military conquest and political legitimacy, as the NCR sought to present itself not merely as an occupying force, but as a protector and unifying authority for local settlements, promising the benefits of citizenship, law, and economic integration to communities willing to pledge allegiance. Internal tensions arose as officers and administrators balanced the demands of frontline combat, diplomacy with local leaders, and the need to maintain public support at home, highlighting the recurring challenge of governing a rapidly growing republic across distant and culturally diverse territories. Securing Hoover Dam itself required not only military prowess, but also careful coordination with engineers, surveyors, and local populations to ensure that the facility could be safely operated and defended, reflecting the NCR's broader recognition that control of key infrastructure was essential to sustaining expansion. The campaign's success reinforced the strategic principle that territorial conquest alone was insufficient. Enduring authority required integration of military, economic, and administrative tools to bind newly acquired lands to the Republic's core. At the same time, the operation exposed vulnerabilities inherent in overextension, as the logistical demands of the Mojave campaign strained the NCR's resources, diverted attention from other territories, and created friction between civilian and military authorities over priorities, funding, and governance. By the conclusion of the Mojave campaign, the NCR had not only extended its de facto borders to include a critical water and energy hub, but had also demonstrated a model of territorial expansion that combined force, infrastructure, and diplomacy, a model that would guide future operations, even as it sowed the seeds of overreach, internal tension, and the complex political challenges that would come to define the Republic's later history. The occupation of newly incorporated territories by the new California Republic revealed the complex and often fragile balance between governance, coercion, and local acceptance, as the Republic's efforts to impose order and integrate disparate communities frequently provoked resistance that challenged both its military and administrative capabilities. Following campaigns such as the Mojave Operation, NCR authorities sought to consolidate control by establishing forts, garrisons, and administrative offices to enforce law, collect taxes, and regulate trade, transforming conquered or allied settlements into nodes of Republican influence. While these measures were intended to protect citizens and ensure stability, they also served as visible symbols of external authority, often alienating local populations who had previously operated under informal governance, tribal leadership, or independent trade networks. Resistance emerged in multiple forms, from passive noncompliance and civil disobedience to outright rebellion, with some communities refusing to recognize NCR law, withholding taxes, or rejecting appointed officials, while raider groups and rival factions exploited these tensions to destabilize Republican authority and assert alternative claims over territory. The NCR responded with a combination of diplomacy, concessions, and selective military intervention, attempting to balance the Republic's ideals of representation and rule of law with the practical necessity of demonstrating that defiance carried consequences. Occupation policies were further complicated by the Republic's reliance on local collaborators, who were often granted authority in exchange for allegiance. Yet their presence sometimes intensified resentment, as citizens perceived them as puppets of a distant capital rather than legitimate leaders. Trade regulations and taxation, while essential for sustaining the Republic's logistical and military needs, frequently provoked friction, particularly when resource allocation prioritized military outposts or central territories over frontier communities, creating the perception of exploitation and neglect. Cultural differences between NCR officials and local populations, including differing social norms, religious practices, and economic customs, often amplified tensions, highlighting the challenges of imposing a uniform political and legal framework across a diverse and dispersed population. These dynamics created a persistent cycle of accommodation and backlash, where temporary compliance was maintained through negotiation, military presence, or economic incentives, but underlying dissatisfaction remained, occasionally erupting into riots, sabotage, or support for anti-NCR factions. The Republic's experience during occupation also exposed the limits of military power in achieving lasting political stability, demonstrating that control of territory required more than garrisons and patrols. It necessitated meaningful engagement with communities, the provision of tangible benefits, and careful attention to local grievances. Over time, patterns emerged in which certain regions became reliably loyal, often due to sustained investment in infrastructure, protection, and integration, while others remained contested, perpetually straining NCR resources and attention. This duality underscored a central challenge of expansion. The very mechanisms that enabled the Republic to grow, laws, taxation, and military oversight, also generated resistance, revealing the inherent tension between the ideals of a democratic republic and the practical realities of governing a sprawling, diverse, and often hostile wasteland. In effect, occupation transformed expansion from a purely external endeavor into an ongoing process of negotiation, coercion, and adaptation, requiring the NCR to balance authority and legitimacy while confronting the persistent unpredictability of human, and sometimes non-human, resistance across its newly acquired lands. As the new California Republic pushed further beyond its original territories, the challenges of sustaining a sprawling nation became increasingly apparent, revealing systemic vulnerabilities in logistics, resource allocation, and the capacity of both military and civilian institutions to manage an overextended state. Expansion, which had once been facilitated by the integration of settlements through law, infrastructure, and trade, now imposed significant demands on supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles of harsh, often inhospitable terrain, leaving caravans, garrisons, and remote outposts vulnerable to raider attacks, environmental hazards, and simple logistical failure. The Republic's reliance on a centralized military to enforce law, protect trade routes, and project authority placed enormous strain on personnel, as soldiers were required to serve in distant territories for prolonged periods with limited rotation or support, leading to fatigue, diminished morale, and reduced operational efficiency. Supply failures were exacerbated by environmental constraints, including arid deserts, irradiated zones, and regions with insufficient arable land to support local provisioning, forcing the NCR to rely heavily on distant food and water shipments that were subject to delay or disruption. These logistical difficulties often created tensions between military and civilian leadership, as commanders demanded additional resources to maintain operational readiness, while administrators in Shady Sands struggled to balance taxation, infrastructure investment, and the needs of the core population. Overextension also amplified political strains, as remote territories developed grievances over perceived neglect, excessive taxation, or unfair enforcement of law, contributing to unrest and sporadic resistance that required additional military attention, further stretching already taxed forces. The Republic's bureaucratic apparatus, designed for the management of smaller, contiguous regions, was ill-equipped to handle the complexity of far-flung territories, resulting in inconsistent administration, corruption, and uneven application of law, which undermined the legitimacy of the state in outlying areas. Military fatigue manifested not only in reduced readiness but also in operational errors, hesitancy in engagement, and occasional over-reliance on harsh measures to maintain control, creating a cycle where the very tools of expansion, army, bureaucracy, and taxation contributed to instability in newly acquired lands. Resource scarcity, compounded by the demands of sustaining both civilian populations and military forces across a wide area, forced the NCR to prioritize certain regions over others, leaving marginal settlements exposed to raids, environmental stress, and the encroachment of rival factions. This selective focus reinforced inequality within the Republic, creating pockets of prosperity contrasted with areas of vulnerability, a disparity that fueled criticism of central governance and provoked internal political debates regarding expansion strategy. Overextension also had strategic consequences, as the dispersion of forces limited the NCR's ability to respond rapidly to threats, reduced operational flexibility, and complicated coordination with allied or neutral settlements. Despite these challenges, expansion continued, driven by the Republic's ideological commitment to unification and the economic incentives of controlling resource-rich lands. Yet each mile of new territory carried the weight of increased logistical complexity, political tension, and the risk of military exhaustion. By confronting the consequences of overextension, supply failures, and fatigue, the NCR encountered the limits of its capacity to govern a vast and diverse wasteland, revealing that the very mechanisms that enabled rapid growth could, if unchecked, threaten the stability, effectiveness, and long-term viability of the Republic itself, setting the stage for both internal reforms and future crises as expansion persisted. As the new California Republic continued its rapid territorial expansion, subtle shifts in governance, policy, and societal norms began to reveal a troubling phenomenon. The Republic, once founded on post-apocalyptic pragmatism and civic cooperation, increasingly mirrored the structural and ideological flaws of pre-war America it had emerged to surpass. Originally, the NCR had emphasized decentralized governance, civic participation, and collective responsibility, seeking to avoid the concentration of power and systemic inequalities that had contributed to the old world's collapse. However, the practical demands of managing far-flung territories, sustaining a standing military, and funding infrastructure inadvertently centralized authority in Shady Sands, elevating bureaucrats, military officers, and political elites whose decisions increasingly shaped policy with limited accountability. Taxation, originally intended to support communal defense and development, became a tool for sustaining expansion and servicing debt incurred by ambitious campaigns, often prioritizing core territories over frontier populations, echoing pre-war economic hierarchies, where wealth and power were concentrated among a few influential actors. Political factions, patronage networks, and corruption emerged more visibly, as senators and local officials cultivated loyalty through favors, contracts, and preferential treatment, reinforcing inequality and eroding the egalitarian principles upon which the NCR had been founded. The military, initially a defensive institution subordinate to civilian authority, gradually became a critical instrument of both expansion and domestic control, its logistical and operational demands shaping policy and influencing political decisions in ways reminiscent of pre-war militarization. Legal codes and regulatory systems, designed to standardize behavior and integrate diverse communities, often imposed burdens on frontier settlements while benefiting established elites, echoing patterns of top-down governance and centralized authority that had previously destabilized the United States. Trade and industrial policies, focused on resource exploitation and economic growth, created wealth disparities that mirrored pre-war corporate dominance, while reliance on Brahmin barons, merchant networks, and agricultural magnates reinforced social stratification across the Republic. Cultural and civic ideals, once framed in terms of collective survival and pragmatic cooperation, began to shift toward notions of progress, expansion, and national prestige, prioritizing the appearance of power and control over the welfare of individual communities. Education, infrastructure development, and administrative integration, while beneficial in sustaining growth, also served to standardize thought, behavior, and allegiance, subtly replacing local customs and self-determination with uniform adherence to Republican norms. The Republic's ideological drift became particularly evident in distant territories, where citizens increasingly experienced NCR authority as coercive or extractive, rather than participatory or protective, fostering resentment and undermining loyalty. This convergence with pre-war societal structures revealed an uncomfortable truth. The pressures of governing a large, resource-dependent, and militarily enforced state had reshaped the Republic, aligning its methods and outcomes with the very political and economic hierarchies it had originally sought to avoid. By emulating pre-war America in its bureaucratic rigidity, social stratification, and concentration of power, the NCR illustrated the recurring tension between ideals and practical governance, demonstrating that even a nation born from the ashes of catastrophe was not immune to the systemic flaws of human institutions when scaled across time, space, and territory. The long-term consequences of the new California Republic's expansion extended far beyond the immediate consolidation of territory, shaping the social, economic, and political landscape of the wasteland in ways that would reverberate for decades and influence both the prospects for human survival and the character of post-war civilization. By asserting authority over vast regions, the NCR imposed a degree of stability and infrastructure previously unseen in the California wasteland, creating secure trade routes, defended settlements, and administrative systems that allowed commerce, agriculture, and governance to flourish in areas that had long suffered from lawlessness and isolation. This consolidation enabled a standardization of laws, currency, and citizenship, binding diverse populations into a shared political framework that encouraged cooperation and created opportunities for economic and social development, while simultaneously extending the Republic's ability to project military power to protect its citizens and borders. However, these gains came at significant cost, as the sheer scale of expansion placed unprecedented strain on resources, logistics, and personnel, exposing the limitations of a system that relied heavily on distant supply lines, a standing army, and bureaucratic oversight to maintain authority. Overextension left remote settlements vulnerable to raider attacks, environmental stress, and insurgent groups, while the prioritization of core territories created regional inequalities and fostered resentment among populations that experienced taxation and regulation as exploitative rather than beneficial. Political corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the influence of wealthy elites, both in the military and civilian sectors, eroded the Republican ideals upon which the NCR was founded, creating structural weaknesses that rival factions and opportunistic actors could exploit in times of crisis. The cultural homogenization inherent in occupation, legal standardization, and economic integration also suppressed local customs and traditions, creating tensions between identity and allegiance that occasionally erupted into resistance or open conflict. Strategically, the Republic's reliance on military enforcement as a tool of expansion institutionalized a dependency on force that would later complicate relations with other major powers, including Caesar's Legion, the Brotherhood of Steel, and independent wasteland communities, making diplomacy a more fraught and militarized endeavor. Economically, the focus on resource extraction, large-scale agriculture, and the empowerment of trade magnates created both prosperity and inequality, concentrating wealth while simultaneously binding populations to the Republic's fiscal needs, a dynamic that fueled both loyalty and latent dissent. Environmentally, the demands of agriculture, industry, and infrastructure contributed to the depletion of local resources, placing additional stress on the fragile post-war ecosystem and forcing the NCR to prioritize territorial expansion over sustainable development. Socially, The integration of diverse communities fostered shared identity and interdependence, yet also introduced cultural friction, as differing values, customs, and priorities had to be reconciled under a uniform political system, sometimes through coercion or suppression. The cumulative effect of these factors ensured that NCR expansion was both transformative and destabilizing, producing a republic capable of unprecedented governance in the wasteland, while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities that would challenge its survival, legitimacy, and cohesion. Ultimately, the long-term consequences of NCR expansion illustrate the paradox of post-war nation-building. The same strategies that enabled rapid growth, territorial consolidation, and social integration also introduced systemic pressures, ethical compromises, and structural flaws that shaped the Republic's future trajectory and the broader history of the wasteland, leaving a legacy defined by both achievement and the enduring challenge of sustaining civilization amid the enduring chaos of a post-apocalyptic world.